some of what I bring out today, for those of you who've heard my other 2 lectures, it will be working in some of the themes that I've already been discussing, but I'm taking it very much in a different direction than the direction of thinking about geology and deep time and fossils that I've been pursuing in my other 2 talks. And my paper is in 7 parts. I know that makes it sound like it's humongous, but it's not that long. It's like 45 minutes. So the parts are of varying length. And I do think of these parts as bits of knowledge that I've collected in my travels, as shards of Eros, if you will, what Foucault calls the errant fragments of an erotic art. And I would say that overall this is an ongoing attempt to rethink sexuality, what we think of as modern sexuality, through the lens of this weird Greek word that we call Eros. Okay, so I'm going to start with 2 epigraphs. The first from Marcuse: "Today the fight for life, the fight for Eros, is the political fight." And from Michel Foucault: "We are less Greek than we believe." 1. Eros is strange. At first glance, the juxtaposition of my 2 epigraphs, one from Marcuse, the other from Foucault, may strike some of you as odd. Marcuse's Freudo-Marxist invocation of Eros as an anti-repressive political concept in his book Eros and Civilization, first published in 1955, was excoriated by Foucault about 20 years later in his critique of the repressive hypothesis in History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And as Foucault's queer children, we've learned to dismiss the Marcusean trap, a dualistic logic of repression and liberation, no and yes, whose biologism fails to account for the complexities of modern power knowledge as an ensemble that affects distributions around the norm in a continuum of apparatuses whose functions are for the most part regulatory. The Marcusean backdrop of our Foucauldian inheritance makes it difficult to talk about Eros without appearing recalcitrant or simply naive. To invoke Eros is to implicitly reactivate a trans-historical conception of sex as life instinct, a timeless biological force waiting to be released from the bourgeois psyche in which it has been captured. Despite these dangers, in Mad for Foucault, and can I just say, this is Foucault. So those of you who haven't seen the cover of this book, this is Foucault with hair in the late 1950s. So in Mad for Foucault, and later in Are the Lips a Grave, I attempted to trace the outline of an ethics of Eros, first in Foucault and then in Foucault with Irigaray. In both those projects, my goal was to challenge conceptions of queer sexuality implicitly structured by a repressive hypothesis they claimed to bypass. More generally, I tried to show how queer articulations of sexuality sometimes remain invested in Freudo-Lacanian ways of knowing, at odds with Foucault's genealogical account of sexuality's contingent formation. I did so by revisiting sexuality in Foucault through the lens of History of Madness, rather than the usual History of Sexuality, Volume 1. More than Volume 1, History of Madness allowed me to focus on the genealogical ethical stakes of rationalized sexuality in biopower, the form of power Foucault describes as the life of the species that biology invented in the 19th century as life itself. Sidestepping the eudaimonistic lure of bodies and pleasures at the end of Volume 1, I followed a different erotic path through the sexual dispositif in Foucault. Beginning with an erotic murmur we can hear in History of Madness, I traced the play of Eros in Foucault's archival practice. I argued that Foucault's erotic archival play contests bios, the biological objectification of life that gives rise to a psyche whose engine is a sexual drive, what Foucault describes in Abnormal as the little black fragment of danger and the newborn death instinct, or in Volume 1, the dark shimmer of sex, in French, le noir éclat du sexe, tucked deep inside of us. I also argued in Mad for Foucault that in History of Madness in Volume 1, Foucault both traces and re-reverses the psychosexual reversal of ancient mad Eros into modern rationalized life. If what was once divine madness, so think Plato, think the Phaedrus, right, is now the site of scientific truth, what happens when we encounter Eros again in the modern formations of individual and collective erotic life? Is the return of Eros simply a lyrical way to describe madness as mental illness? I've argued that Eros cannot be reduced to madness, divine or otherwise, and that there's something in Eros that cannot be contained by the increasingly specifying grids of modern knowledge about life. Rather, in both Mad for Foucault and Are the Lips a Grave, I've suggested that Eros emerges not only in Foucault, but also in Irigaray, Audre Lorde, other queer feminist thinkers, as a way to name the epistemic and corporeal elasticity of a post-moral ethics. Thinking, feeling, practices of living that can stretch and perhaps reconfigure the present orderings of life in biopower. As a provisional suspension of rational morality, this ethics is not a code, but neither is it a paroxystic self-shattering, the negative, non-relational ethics that marks the antisocial strand of queer theory. So here's where I part ways with Lee Edelman. As a post-moral queer feminist ethics, it is not normative in the usual sense, but neither is it simply anti-normative. Like the prick of Eros, it can startle and surprise us. It can pierce us like an arrow and scramble us like a poem. It can name desubjectivating practices of freedom bound to the practices of others. So this lecture is going to pick up where those arguments leave off. And my larger aim in rethinking Eros as strange is to elaborate its political possibilities in ways that differ from a sexual politics of either negative or positive forms of freedom. So remember Marcuse, today the fight for life, the political fight is the fight for, today the fight for life, the fight for Eros is a political fight. My conception of Eros is not simply Marcusean. I do not read Eros as synonymous with life. At the same time, the Freudo-Marcusean transposition of Eros as desire into Eros as life, so that Freud does that and then Marcuse picks up on it, right? So the transposition of Eros as desire into Eros as life cannot simply be ignored. And I do agree in the Marcusean spirit that invigorated the New Left in the US in the 1960s, that there is something political about Eros worth fighting for. That said, I remain attentive to the limits of the sometimes reductive political translations of Eros we've witnessed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So for example, many of the most visible campaigns for sexual liberation, I think, have functioned according to epistemologies of the closet, to repeat Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's phrase. Those epistemologies repeat the binary logic of the repressive hypothesis Foucault spent his life critiquing. As I suggested before, often they take the form of either negative or positive conceptions of freedom. So, for example, the negative freedom to engage in kinky sex of various kinds without interference, right? Or in a positive mode, the right of same-sex couples to marry. So part of what we're after in political terms is a different conception of freedom. And again, I think Foucault is really helpful here. So that's the larger frame. My talk today tries to move beyond the arguments in my two books on Eros by looking more closely at how Foucauldian Eros articulates an important aspect of what he variously calls genealogy, historical ontology, or the historical a priori. These are all terms that are somewhat synonymous for Foucault. All of these terms describe a peculiarly Foucauldian way of approaching a past whose very conception is fractured by the contingencies of time. Foucault introduces genealogy not in opposition to history, but in opposition to what he calls the meta-historical deployment of ideal significations and indefinite teleologies. Further, genealogy seeks out the singularity of events in what Foucault calls the most unpromising of places, in what we tend to feel is without history, in sentiments, love, conscience, instincts. So, for example, today affect theory is all the rage, and that's great, it's fabulous. Affect has a history, right? You could put it under the category of sentiments. So does love, conscience, instinct. So too does Eros. And yet, genealogy opposes itself to the search for origins. There is no origin where we will find Eros, which brings me to my second epigraph. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault reminds us that we are less Greek than we believe. The erotic relation between Erastes and Eromenos we encounter in Plato is not the homosexual mode of an original Greek substance or nature called love. For Foucault, the Greeks were not gay, and throughout his work, Foucault cautions us against making trans-historical assumptions that would link Alcibiades to the medieval sodomite to today's happily marrying gay couples. Discourse is not life, Foucault writes in The Archaeology of Knowledge. Its time is not your time. So if Eros is a strange word, a foreign word, an ancient word that no longer has any meaning for us, if, as Foucault says, we are less Greek than we believe, what does it mean to reinvoke Eros? 2, Foucault's historical a priori. So this is like the most kind of philosophical, gnarly part, but then it'll open up again, so bear with me. So what does it mean to reinvoke Eros? I want to focus here on what it means to explore Eros as part of what Foucault called in 1984 the critical task of doing a historical ontology of ourselves. If such a task defines all of Foucault's work, we can draw a link between the historical a priori of Foucault's archaeological period, so that I'm thinking here specifically of the order of things and the archaeology of knowledge, a link between the archaeological period and the methods he later called genealogy and problematization. The historical a priori is what distinguishes Foucault from most other philosophers whose hallowed custom is, as Nietzsche puts it, to think non-historically. The historical, Foucault, by contrast, engages in what he famously calls writing a history of the present. To write histories of the present is not to historicize in a typical sense. It is not to write about the past from the perspective of the present. Rather, it is to write from a perspective that destabilizes the present and makes it strange. To write from a place Foucault describes as the border of time that surrounds our presence, which overhangs it, and which indicates it in its otherness. More specifically, the historical a priori names the materiality of what Foucault calls the archive, a complex volume of different types of positivity, which is not simply the sum of documents preserved by a culture, but the operating system that allows some statements and events to appear while others fade. Most important, the material and epistemic limits of the archive both bind and unbind us in relation to our own time. Thus, for Foucault, thinking is a function of the binding and unbinding forces of time, and the historical a priori articulates a double movement of binding and unbinding. It both situates or grounds us within the necessary conditions of our own knowledge, and at the same time, it unmoors us by exposing us to the fragmenting contingency of temporal change. The historical a priori, as Beatrice Hahn and others have pointed out, the term itself is paradoxical. If the a priori is an eternal ideal, a template of order that is not contingent, how can that a priori be historical and therefore contingent? This question impinges on a frequent philosophical critique of Foucault, one made by Kantians like Hahn, but also by Habermas and others. The critique asks, if Foucault's project involves the excavation of the ground or the conditions that make our own thinking possible, how is it that he is not bound and delimited by the same regime of intelligibility that binds every other thinker in a particular episteme? As Amy Allen puts it in her beautiful book on Foucault and Habermas, The Politics of Ourselves, from what perspective can he claim to have access to these conditions? Does not the claim that he can have access to them require Foucault to jump over his own shadow? So I want to suggest in response to these questions that the temporal border that touches our time both establishes the limit between us and what we are not, and at the same time makes us coextensive with the otherness that delimits us. Contact with the archive is thus the erotic touch of a temporal otherness that deprives us of our continuities. It bursts open the other and the outside. This is what it means to historicize, to dissipate that temporal identity in which we are pleased to look at ourselves when we wish to exercise the discontinuities of history. In this sense, the historical a priori not only binds us to the necessary conditions of our epistemic ground, it also unbinds us. Those conditions of our epistemic ground are radically contingent and therefore ungrounding. Even as I sit here making an epistemic claim, the ground is shifting beneath my feet. These important questions about the historical a priori help me to situate what I want to say about Eros. As a term that reemerges in the 20th century, most prominently in Freud, again, but also in Marcuse, Eros is out of sync with its own time. In his book on Eros in Foucault and Lacan, John Rockman calls Freud's conception of Eros an archaism, a fictive anthropology, or prehistory of the primal. In the modern episteme, Eros is untimely, just as Don Quixote is one of the untimely ones who, in the order of things, speaks of resemblances in the age of representation. His untimeliness makes him mad. The madman, Foucault writes in the order of things, is the man of primitive resemblances. He is the disordered player of the same and the other. Through the lens of erotic madness, as a kind of Don Quixote figure, I want to ask, are we simply bound to our own time? Or might Eros offer us a way of thinking about the unbinding dimension of the historical a priori as chance, as contingency, as change, the untimely dimension of the historical a priori? Indeed, doesn't the term eros, as a Greek word, pinpoint precisely the mutually constitutive, paradoxical relation between forces that bind and unbind? In Sappho, for example, here's some fragments of Sappho. The desire as lack that Eros names draws the lovers apart, even as it brings them together. As the poet and classicist Anne Carson puts it in Eros, the Bittersweet, the lover, the beloved, and that which comes between them are 3 points of transformation on a circuit of possible relationship, electrified by desire so that they touch, not touching. Conjoined, they are held apart. Bound, they are unbound, we might say. So too in Plato. Recall in the Symposium, Aristophanes' comic speech about 3 kinds of spheres cut in 2 who spend their lives seeking their lost half. This is ultimately the myth of an impossible binding. If Eros is the desire to be bound into a whole, Aristophanes shows that this desire is self-canceling. As Martha Nussbaum explains, such a wholeness would put an end to all movement and all passion. In a later speech, Alcibiades, by contrast, describes Eros, or the experience of love, as a sudden openness, and at the same time, an overwhelming desire to open. That opening is both sexual and epistemic. As an object of love and as an object of knowledge, the sphere, Nussbaum says, has become a thing full of holes. Alcibiades, the eromenos, breaks the social fabric by surrendering to his passion and his shame and his desire for Socrates. The binding force of Eros we saw in Aristophanes becomes in Alcibiades an equally powerful force of unbinding. So Alcibiades' sphere full of holes can function heuristically as an image to describe how Foucault is both bound and unbound by the historical a priori. So my hypothesis here is that the term Eros gives us a way to qualify our experience of historical time as that which delimits us and our knowledge. If we're bound by the historical a priori, its openness, its contingency also unbinds us. And this is important for us, we modern subjects, we other Victorians, as sexual subjects, as Freudian subjects driven by sex. The erotic dimension of the historical a priori, its paradoxical aspect as binding and unbinding, gives us another way to think sexuality, an alternative to the repressive hypothesis about which Foucault had so many doubts. So this is my hypothesis. Foucault reignites Eros in modernity for ethical reasons, as a way to transform our experience of sexuality, one that orders us through the logic of bios. We can re-experience our biopolitical historical a priori, the sexual dispositif, as erotic. That erotic experience has the capacity to transform us epistemically, ethically, and perhaps politically. And yet, let's not forget, even as I conjure this image of Foucault and of ourselves as Alcibiades, as a sphere full of holes, we are less Greek than we believe. So I insist once again on Foucault's reminder about the otherness of the Greeks, because I want to distinguish my approach to Eros from some of the scholarly work that draws on Foucault to propose a modern ethics of ascesis, or care of the self. Foucault is clear. We are not the Greeks. There is no the self in the ancient world. The elite practices of philosopher kings are not a model for us, either as a reflection of our own origins or as a future utopian ideal. Foucault's doubts about our Greekness are important for understanding how Eros, a Greek word, might function in the present to temporarily interrupt or suspend the ordering of life we call biopower. If we're less Greek than we believe, but the political fight is the fight for Eros, what can it mean to invoke that word Eros, whose very untranslatability leaves us groping for the light switch? 3, prowling Eros. In the Symposium, Alcibiades compares Socrates to the statues of the ugly satyr and companion of Dionysus, Silenus. Alcibiades says, "Once I caught Socrates when he was open like the statues of Silenus, and I had a glimpse of the figures he keeps hidden within. They were so godlike, so bright and beautiful, so utterly amazing, that I no longer had a choice. I just had to do whatever he told me." And this is from the Symposium. Alcibiades is undone by Socrates opened up like an ugly statue. As a way to describe the quality of our experience of the historical a priori, Eros might be like that scene in the Symposium. Eros is a term, untranslated, that opens up the present and makes it strange. Again, I'm guided here by Anne Carson's thinking about her own gorgeously impossible translations of Greek and Latin texts. Take, for instance, Carson's accordion-style artist's book, Knox. I don't know if you all have seen this, but it's a very beautiful book, or Night, which is a reproduction of a handmade book she made in homage to her dead brother. On the first page, we find a poem. Multas per gentes et multa per equora vectus, etc. I'm not going to read the whole thing. We later learn that this is an elegy by Catullus, the 1st century Latin poet who wrote this poem on the occasion of his brother's death on distant shores. As we open the accordion that is Anne Carson's book, the fugitive visions of its pleated form create a shadow play of night and day, dark and light. Moving forward from Catullus, each page is devoted, word by word, to a dictionary rendering of the Latin original, carefully crafted to reverberate with the story of her brother's life. Multas, numerous, many, many of. Ne multa, to cut a long story short. Multa lux, broad daylight. Multa nux, late in the night, perhaps too late, and so on, with per, gentes, et, etc. And every other word in the Latin poem. So in a way, the whole book is like a dictionary that just gives the definitions of each word in the Catullus poem. Like Foucault, Carson uses history as her guide, invoking Herodotus, the, quote, father of history, for whom history is at once concrete and indecipherable. Historian can be a story dog that roams around Asia Minor, collecting bits of muteness, like burrs in its hide. In a cigarette smoke-soaked Copenhagen, under a wide, thin, sorrowful sky, as swans drift down the water, I am looking a long time into the muteness of my brother, she writes. It resists me. Carson juxtaposes this historical autobiographical dictionary as poem with reflections, photographs, and other material traces of her brother's life, now gone. Near its center, we find, like Silenus opened up, Carson's English translation of the Catullus poem. Many the peoples, many the oceans I crossed, I arrive at these, poor brother, burials so I could give you the last gift owed to death and talk, why, with mute ash. Now that fortune tore you from me, you, O poor, wrongly, brother, wrongly taken from me, now still anyway this, what a distant mood of parents handed down as the sad gift for burials, accept, soaked with tears of a brother and into forever, brother, farewell and farewell. Reflecting on this multi-layered task of translation, Carson writes, no one can approximate Catullan diction, which at its most sorrowful has an air of deep festivity, like one of those trees that turns all its leaves over silver in the wind. I never arrived at the translation I would have liked to do of Poem 101, but over the years of working on it, I came to think of translating as a room, not exactly an unknown room where one gropes for the light switch. Just as Carson gropes for knowledge of only partially translatable words and rhythms, so too she gropes for knowledge of the now lost life of a brother she never really knew. I guess it never ends. A brother never ends. I prowl him, she writes. He does not end. We turn the page. Frater, see above. Frater, fratris. And then, prowling the meanings of a word, prowling the history of a person, no use expecting a flood of light. So too with Foucault's Eros. Eros is a room, not an unknown room, where I'm groping for the light switch. Prowling Foucault, I prowl Eros. No use expecting a flood of light. 4. Ars erotica. In History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Foucault translates Eros through the oddly Latin lens of modern science. Have you ever looked at a medical textbook? It's a bit like Carson's translation of Catullus, fragments of Latin and Greek trying to shed light. Ilium, a segment of the small bowel, comes from the Greek word alos, meaning twisted. The pudendum names the external genitalia from the Latin verb pudere, to be ashamed. Vulva is the Latin word for a wrapper. In Foucault, under the microscopic gaze of a scientia sexualis that reworks the bits and fragments of an ancient lexicon, Eros reappears as ars erotica, in a binary relation that Foucault describes as the two great procedures for producing the truth of sex. On the one hand, Foucault says, we have ars erotica. He lists China, Japan, India, Rome, and the Arabo-Muslim societies. On the other hand, we have the only civilization to practice scientia sexualis. Foucault goes on to list a number of criteria that differentiate ars erotica from scientia sexualis in a typology that has led numerous critics to accuse him of Orientalism. Reading quickly, Anne Stoller complains in her book about Foucault, Race and the Education of Desire, we are offered a distinction between an erotic art of the Orient and a science of sexuality of the West. Stoller finds Foucault to be here as elsewhere, quote, scrupulously ethnocentric, unquote. We do not have to read too slowly or too closely to notice that Foucault's list of Oriental societies in Volume 1 is not only Oriental. It includes Rome, and a few pages later, Greece. Volume 1 is a book full of ruses. In such a book, the one who cries Orientalism may find herself caught in a trap of her own making. Here, the dualism between the Orientalist charge turns out to be but behind the Orientalist charge, turns out to be asymmetrical. The Orientalist accusation boomerangs back toward the accuser. For what is the logic of Orientalism if not the elision of differences within that distinguish one element from another, one society from another in a series? And indeed, even as Foucault sets up the dualism, he claims our society breaks with the tradition of ars erotica, the distinction is already collapsing in on itself. Scientia sexualis is an ars erotica, Foucault writes. Specifically, in the scientific pleasures of analysis, we encounter what Foucault calls the errant fragments of an erotic art, a bit like those etymological scraps of Greek and Latin we find in modern medical textbooks. I want to leave volume 1 for a moment and return to History of Madness to try to better understand what Foucault means by these errant fragments of an erotic art that constitute scientia sexualis. As I've already suggested in my previous work in History of Madness, we can hear a murmur of Eros as it ebbs and flows over the course of this massive book. So in The Ship of Fools, in the love poetry of Louise Labbé, in what he calls the, quote, lyrical homosexuality of the Renaissance, in Erasmus's statement in The Praise of Folly that, quote, you will find everything reversed if you open up the Silenus, unquote, in Rameau's Nephew's embrace of the lure of the sensible, in the, quote, porous body of the hysteric, quote, maddened by love, in Nietzsche's cry as he collapses into madness with his arms flung around the neck of a horse. These are all quotes from History of Madness. As a Dionysian, ecstatic, paradoxical form of love, these mad fragments of Eros become visible to readers of History of Madness as forms of living that are excluded by reason. In the post-Cartesian world that follows the Great Confinement of the middle of the 17th century in Paris, pre-modern Eros is lost, along with unreason. The blind madness of the body and the great intoxication of the soul that placed unreason in a position of knowledge is confined and excluded, banished by the eye of the modern cogito, the Cartesian cogito. Like unreason, in modernity, Eros no longer has any meaning. As Foucault puts it, for the classical age, unreason had the value of a noun and had a substantive function. But, he continues, we have lost the ability to understand unreason other than in its adjectival form. So we say unreasonable all the time, and we know what that means, but to use the word unreason would be very weird. It's not a word that we really use. So what I want to say here is that I want to make a parallel claim about Eros. As a noun, Eros, like unreason, is unintelligible to us. We have lost the ability to understand Eros other than in its adjectival form, as erotic. And, you know, we all think we know what the erotic is, right? This is the erotic. How then does Eros return to us in all its untimeliness to make our present strange? 5, erotic time. By what spiral, here's my cheesy PowerPoint, by what spiral, Foucault asks in volume 1, did we come to affirm that sex is negated? The question, like the repressive hypothesis he critiques, is itself paradoxical. By what spiral, we might ask, did Eros become sexuality? By what spiral did divine madness become the rational site of our deepest scientific knowledge about ourselves? To cite Foucault, by what spiral did we arrive at the point where we, quote, expect our intelligibility to come from what was for many centuries thought of as madness? The figure of the spiral allows Foucault to make a distinction between the kind of paradox that collapses in on itself, what he calls the sterile paradox of the repressive hypothesis that keeps us bound and paralyzed by our own time, and the paradoxical logic of the strange recursive time that opens us to experiences of unbinding. First, the sterile paradox that binds. As Foucault puts it at the beginning of volume 1, to say that sex is not repressed is to utter a sterile paradox. If repression is the great mechanism destined to say no, as Foucault puts it, to say no to repression is to repeat the very gesture we've set out to contest. Such a gesture will continue to be sterile no matter how many times we repeat it. Like a scientia sexualis that turns out to be a self-subjugating ars erotica whose greatest pleasure is that of analysis, the sterile paradox of saying no to repression produces an opposition that collapses in on itself and goes nowhere. With the figure of the spiral, however, Foucault introduces the possibility of unbinding and ethical transformation. The sterile paradox, how is it that we affirm that sex is negated, becomes the transformational paradox of historical time. How is it that sex, a product of reason, was once madness, a product of unreason? How is it that our intelligibility was once unintelligible? The static dualism of the sterile paradox becomes the recursive movement of spiraling time, where something disappears and returns with a difference. In History of Madness, that something is what Foucault calls unreason. The background, or in French the word is fond, the background or fond that makes reason, madness, and history possible. The necessity of madness, Foucault writes in the 1961 preface to History of Madness, is linked to that decisive action that extracts a significant language from the background noise, or the bruit de fond. The necessity of madness is linked to the possibility of history. So if unreason is the background, the fond, it is eclipsed by reason, even as its shadows constitute the conditions for the possibility of reason's light. One aspect of that light is linear time, the possibility of history that requires madness as its foil. As reason's foil, madness becomes part of reason, a form of reason whose time, the time of the episteme, the Hegelian time of history, is the chronological time that binds us. Foucault calls this the linearity that led rationalist thought to consider madness as a form of mental illness. But in History of Madness, there is another time, what Foucault calls the untimely, time of unreason, what he calls an unconditional return and an absolute plunge that Foucault differentiates from the time of madness. So he's differentiating between the time of unreason and the time of madness, and the time of madness is actually the time of reason. So differentiating from the time of madness, which develops along the chronology of a history. The time of unreason is the time of the fond, or the background, where in a recursive movement, unreason returns and the line of history forms a spiral. The logic of what Foucault calls that strange return allows us, Foucault's readers, to reinterpret the time of madness, reason's time, in what Foucault calls its vertical dimension. The strange return allows us to hear the background noise out of which reason's time was extracted. So I want to suggest that in a similar logic, Eros is the background noise of unreason out of which the language of sexuality is extracted. Through the logic of the spiral, an erotic background reappears in the present, in all its strangeness, as Eros. In so doing, this erotic recurrence makes the familiar ground of our sexual knowledge strange to us, revealing its rifts, its instabilities, and its flaws. Eros emerges as an untimely noun, out of sync with its own time. Eros reverberates like sounds in a room, where that room is like Carson's impossible translation of Catullus. That room is our episteme, our historical a priori, the space of our historical present. And suddenly we find we are strangers to ourselves, groping for the light switch. 6. Bodies and pleasures. At the end of Volume 1, Foucault famously writes, "One day, perhaps, in a different economy of bodies and pleasures, people will no longer quite understand how the ruses of sexuality were able to subject us to that austere monarchy of sex. One day, perhaps, people will no longer quite understand." This is another way of saying, one day, perhaps, sexuality will have become strange. Over a decade earlier, in 1964, reflecting on History of Madness, Foucault wrote a similar sentence. "One day, perhaps, we will no longer know what madness was." One day, perhaps, we will no longer know what madness was. Un jour, peut-être, on ne saura plus ce qu'a pu être la folie. This is another way of saying one day perhaps those forms of madness captured by reason as mental illness will have become unrecognizable to us. What are we to make of this proleptic language? What might this temporally split grammar of the future anterior tell us about the defamiliarizing temporality of Eros? Scholars and activists alike have tended to read this famous sentence from Volume 1 as a utopian moment in Foucault, the projection of a future of libidinal release that undermines his critique of the repressive hypothesis. He has this critique, but then at the end, he's like giving us this freedom, right, in this release of sex. Such a reading makes sense. As Foucault puts it 2 pages earlier, the rallying point for our attack on sexuality must not be sex desire, but bodies and pleasures. In the sentence before that, he says that we must counter the grips of power with the claims of bodies, pleasures, and knowledges. Many a queer thinker has clung to those sentences that suddenly appear like rays of sunshine at the end of the darkest chapter of Foucault's entire oeuvre, right? Part 5 of Volume 1 is about the biopolitical life of the species and the eugenic ordering of society. It is a very, very dark chapter. And at the end, you have these rays of light. So if we've read a bit of Foucault, we might be suspicious of that sunshiny feeling. Might those alluring bodies and pleasures be another ruse in the Book of Ruses? Foucault gives a nod to that suspicion in the very last sentence, where he speaks of the irony of this deployment, the dispositif of sexuality, a dispositif that includes his own book, the very book we've been reading in our quest for sexual freedom. The irony of this dispositif, he writes, is in having us believe that our liberation is in the balance. Foucault seems to be suggesting that retrieving bodies and pleasures, or bodies, pleasures, and knowledges, or power, knowledge, pleasure, is not about liberation or freedom. Such a path of retrieval would land us back in the sterile paradox of the yes-no logic of the repressive hypothesis, where saying yes to bodies and pleasures would mean saying no to power. The different economy of bodies and pleasures of the future anterior is not simply a directive to say yes to pleasure and no to sex desire. Bodies, pleasures, knowledges, and desires are all part of what Foucault calls the assujettissement, the subjection as subjugation, that is becoming a subject. We have learned to dress up that becoming a subject, that assujettissement, as what Foucault calls the agency of sex. There is no utopian future in Foucault's thinking. Indeed, I want to argue that Foucault's proleptic sentences here in Volume 1 are not about the future at all. Rather, if they give us a directive, that directive is about how we might inhabit the present. It is a directive to re-encounter our own time as strange. These ruses of sexuality, Foucault writes, are what ought to make us wonder today. Foucault seems to be asking us today to view our present as if we were looking back from a future episteme in which we will no longer understand how the ruses of sexuality were able to subject us, as if we were looking back from a future episteme in which we no longer know what madness or sexuality was. If there is a normative ought anywhere in Foucault, I think this is it. We ought to wonder about the present. That ethical imperative, if you want to call it that, is a directive to inhabit our present as strange. If ethics answers the question, how are we to live, we ought to live our time as strange. We are bound by that time, by the historical a priori that produces us as sexual subjects, but we can experience the historical a priori as erotic. Eros returns in the spiraling movement of vertical time to estrange us from our own bodies, knowledges, and pleasures, from our own scientific ars erotica, whose increasingly neurologically, scientifically scanned bodies are formed by our greatest pleasure, the pleasure of analysis. We are indeed bound to that ars erotica, but that ars erotica can also unbind us, like reverberations in a room, not into the future, but here, now. 7, now and again. So let me conclude. Untranslated Eros is a noun that has outlived its meaning. In a very real sense, Greek eros has become unintelligible to us, except in its Freudo-Marcusian form, as life instinct, as the opposite of thanatos, as life itself, as bios. I hope I've shown that it is here precisely in its modern borrowing that the strangeness of eros can become useful to us. As Foucault puts it, in ancient culture, eros was divided into either a blind madness of the body or the great intoxication of the soul that placed unreason in a position of knowledge. But the classical age transformed the ancient play of eros into a system where love was either reasoned or governed by unreason. And so, like unreason, eros belongs to an episteme that no longer has meaning for us. At the same time, it bears witness to a historical background, or fond, out of which modern conceptions of ourselves are extracted. Eros is not a substance or metaphysical source of existence. Like unreason, it is an unstable, shifting, temporally contingent figure, what Foucault calls a prodigious and lacunary reserve. Again, paradoxical. Again, a fond that makes history and meaning possible, even as it undoes that history and that meaning. To be sure, if the modern psychological, scientific language of reason betrays unreason by making it intelligible, that language betrays eros as well. The betrayal is a function of the alterity of the past. What was once nonsense is now the site of our intelligibility, and we are left stuck in an aporia. But the strangeness of that aporia, the no passage of the Greek aporos, allows us to trace an oblique, queer, spiraling line through the vertical, recursive, paradoxical time of unreason that makes eros rebound into the present. This is the double time that Foucault describes in History of Madness. Let's call that double time erotic. As Carson puts it in Eros, the Bittersweet, the blind point of Eros is a paradox in time. With Sappho's Greek adverb, deote, which means paradoxically both now and again, the lover finds herself trapped in what Carson calls the perversities of time, pinned in an impossible double bind, victim of novelty and of recurrence at once. Perhaps here and now, eros is neither a noun nor an adjective. Perhaps, as Carson puts it, eros is a verb, a paradoxical doing that is also an undoing, an embodied thinking, a feeling praxis. Perhaps such a verb can shake up the present, what Roland Barthes calls that difficult tense, and make it reverberate as strange. Thank you.